Chapter 3, then. The Game. When I deemed it wise to depart from Vela, I knotted her yellow slave livery around her neck and cried out, "Begone, slave!" And then I slapped my hands together, at which juncture she let forth a howl, as though she had been struck, and then, blubbering hysterically and crying out, she scrambled from the alcove hastily and awkwardly, half falling, descending the narrow ladder, and fled weeping from the Parga Tavern, much to the delight and amusement of the customers below. Oh, wait a moment. A few minutes later I emerged, descended the ladder, and went to the proprietor of the shop, throwing the pleasure silk and the slave chains to the counter. I looked at him, and he didn't ask for pay, but looked away. I left the tavern and entered the street. It was still light and early in the evening. I was not much afraid of being recognized. I had dyed my hair black. I hadn't been in R for several years. I wore the habiliments of the caste of assassins. I looked around. I have always been impressed with R, for it is the largest, the most populous, and the most luxurious city of all known Gaul. Its walls, its countless cylinders, its spires and towers, its lights, its beacons, the high bridges, the lamps, the lanterns of the bridges, are unbelievably exciting and fantastic, particularly as seen from the more lofty bridges or on the roofs of the higher cylinders. But perhaps they are most marvellous as when seen at night from Tarnbach. I remembered the night so many years ago when I had first streaked over the walls of R on the planting feast, and had made the strike of a townsman for the home stone of Gaul's greatest city, glorious R. As I could, I put these thoughts from my mind, but I couldn't fully escape them, for among them was the memory of a girl, she, Talena, the daughter of the Ubar of Ubars, Marlenus, who had so many years before been the free companion of a simple warrior of Coribar, he who had been torn from her at the will of the priest-kings and returned to distant earth, there to wait until he was needed again for another turn of play in the harsh games of Gaul. When the city of Coribar had been destroyed by priest-kings, and its people scattered, no two standing together, the girl had disappeared. The warrior of Coribar had never found her. He didn't know whether she was alive or dead. For those who passed in the street, some might have been startled had they noted, standing in the shadows, one who wore the black of the assassins, but who wept. "Game! Game!" I heard, and quickly shook my head, driving away the memories of R and the girl once known and always loved. The word actually cried was "Kesa," which is Gorean for game. It's a general term, but when used without qualification, it stands for only one game. The man who called out wore a robe of checkered red and yellow squares, and a game board of similar squares with 10 ranks and 10 files, giving 100 squares, hung over his back. Slung over his left shoulder, as a warrior wears a sword, was a leather bag containing the pieces, 20 to a side, red and yellow, representing spearmen, townsmen, the riders of the High Thalarian, and so on. The object of the game is the capture of the opponent's home stone. Capturings of individual pieces and continuations take place much as in chess. The affinities of this game with chess are, I am confident, more than incidental. I recall that men from many periods and cultures of earth had been brought from time to time to Gaul, or counter-earth. With them they would have brought their customs, their skills, their habits, their games, which in time, presumably have undergone considerable modification. I have suspected that chess, with its fascinating history and development as played on earth, may actually have derived from a common ancestor with the Gorean game, both of them perhaps tracing their lineage to some long-forgotten game, or perhaps the draughts of Egypt, or some primitive board game of India. It might be mentioned that the game, as I shall speak of it, for in Gorean it has no other designation, the game is extremely popular on Gore, and even children find it among their playthings and the pieces of the game. There are numerous clubs and competitions among various castes and cylinders. Careful records of important games are kept and studied. Lists of competitions and tournaments and their winners are filed in the cylinder of documents. There is even in most Gorean libraries a section containing an incredible number of scrolls pertaining to the techniques, tactics, and strategy of the game. Almost all civilized Goreans, of whatever caste, play. It is not unusual to find even children, 12 or 14 years perhaps, who play with a depth and sophistication, a subtlety and a brilliance that might be the envy of the chess masters of earth. But this man now approaching was not an amateur, nor an enthusiast. He was a man who would be respected by all castes in Gore. He was a man who would be recognized, most likely, not only by every urchin wild in the streets of the city, but by the Ubar as well. He was a player, a professional, one who earned his living through the game. The players are not a caste nor a clan, but they tend to be a group apart, living their own lives. They are made of men from various castes, who often have little in common but the game, but that is more than enough. They are men who commonly have an extraordinary aptitude for the game, but beyond this, men who have become drunk on it, men lost in the subtle, abstract liquors of variation, pattern, and victory, men who live for the game, who want it and need it as other men might want gold, or others power and women, or others the rolled narcotic strings of toxic candour. There are competitions of players, with purses provided by amateur organizations, and sometimes by the city itself, and these purses are, upon occasion, enough to enrich a man. But most players earn a miserable living by hawking their wares, a contest with a master in the street. The odds are usually 1 to 40, 1 copper tarndisk against 40 pieces, sometimes against an 8-piece, and sometimes the amateur who would play the master insists on further limitations, such as the option to 3 consecutive moves at a point in the game of his choice, or that the master must remove from the board before the game begins his 2 townsmen, or his rider of the Hythalarian. Further, in order to gain players, the master, if wise, occasionally loses a game, which is expensive at the normal odds, and the game must be lost subtly, that the amateur must believe he has won. I had once known a warrior in Corybar, a dull, watery-eyed fellow, who boasted of having beaten Quintus of Tor in a Parga tavern in Thentis. Those who play the game for money have a hard lot, for the market is a buyer's market, and commonly men will play with them only on terms of their own satisfaction. I myself, when Kentius of Kos was in Corybar, might have played him on the bridge near the cylinder of warriors for only a pair of copper tarndisks. It seemed sad to me that I, who knew so little of the game, could have so cheaply purchased the privilege of sitting across the board from such a master. It seemed to me that they should pay a tarndisk of gold just to be permitted to watch such a master play. But such were not the economic realities of the game. In spite of having the respect, even to some degree the adulation, of almost all Goreans, the players lived poorly. On the street of coins they found it difficult to even arrange loans. They were not popular with innkeepers, who wouldn't shelter them unless they paid in advance. Many were the nights a master would be found rolled in robes in a Parga tavern, where, for a bit of task meat and a pot of Parga and an evening's free play with customers, he would be permitted to sleep. Many of the players dreamt of the day they might be nominated for intercity competitions at the fairs of the Tsardars, for a victor at the Tsardar fair earns enough to keep himself and well for years, which he then would devote to the deeper study of the game. There is also some money for the masters in the annotation of games, printed on large boards near the central cylinder, in preparation for editing of scrolls on the game, and in the providing of instruction for those who would improve their skills. On the whole, however, the players live extremely poorly. Further, there is harsh competition among themselves for the position in certain streets and on certain bridges. The most favourable locations for play are, of course, the higher bridges in the vicinity of the richer cylinders, the most expensive taverns, and so on. These positions or territories are allotted by the outcome of games among the players themselves. In R, the high bridge near the central cylinder, housing the palace of the Ubar and the meeting place of the city's high council, was held, and had been held for 4 years, by the young and brilliant fiery Scoramus of R. "Game!" I heard an answering cry, and a fat fellow of the caste of vintners, puffing and bright-eyed, wearing a white tunic with a representation in green cloth of leaves about the collar and down the sleeves of the garment, stepped forward from a doorway. Without speaking, the player sat down cross-legged on one side of the street, and placed a board in front of him. Opposite him sat the vintner. "Set the pieces," said the player. I was surprised, and looked more closely, as the vintner took the wallet filled with game pieces from the man's shoulder, and began with his stubby fingers to quickly arrange the pieces. The player was a rather old man, extremely unusual on Gore, where the stabilization serums were developed centuries ago by the caste of physicians in Corabar and R. They were transmitted to the physicians of other cities at several of the Tsardar fairs. Age on Gore, interestingly, was regarded, and still is, by the caste of physicians as a disease, not an inevitable natural phenomenon. The fact that it seemed to be a universal disease did not dissuade the caste from considering how it might be combated. Accordingly, the research of centuries was turned to this end. Many other diseases, which presumably flourished centuries ago on Gore, tended to be neglected as less dangerous and less universal than that of aging. As a result, they tended to be in those susceptible to many diseases who died, and those less susceptible lived on, propagating their kind. One supposes something similar may have happened with the plagues of the Middle Ages on earth. At any rate, disease is now almost unknown among Gorean cities, with the exception of the dreaded Darkosis disease, or holy disease, research on which is generally frowned upon by the caste of initiates, who insist the disease is a visitation of the displeasure of priest-kings on its recipients. The fact that the disease tends to strike those who have maintained the observances recommended by the caste of initiates, and who regularly attend their numerous ceremonies, as well as those who do not, is seldom explained, though, when pressed, the initiates speak of possible secret failures to maintain the observances, or the inscrutable will of the priest-kings. I also think that the Gorean success in combating aging may be partly due to the severe limitations, in many matters, on the technology of the human beings on the planet. Priest-kings have no wish that men become powerful enough on Gore to challenge them for their supremacy of the planet. They believe, perhaps correctly, that man is a shrewish animal, which, if it had the power, would be likely to fear priest-kings and attempt to exterminate them. Be that as it may, the priest-kings have limited man severely on this planet in many respects, notably in weaponry, communication, and transport. On the other hand, the brilliance which men might have turned into this destructive channels was then diverted, almost of necessity, to other fields, most noticeably to medicine, though considerable achievements have been accomplished in the production of translation devices, illumination, and architecture. The stabilization serums, which are regarded as the right of all human beings, be they civilized or barbarian, friend or enemy, are administered in a series of injections, and the effect is, incredibly, an eventual gradual transformation of certain genetic structures, resulting in indefinite cell replacement without pattern deterioration. These genetic alterations, moreover, are commonly capable of being transmitted. For example, though I received a series of injections when I first came to Gore many years ago, I had been told by physicians that they might, in my case, have been unnecessary, for I was the child of parents who, though of earth, had been of Gore and had received the serums. But different human beings respond differently to the stabilization serums, and the serums are more effective with some than with others. With some the effects last indefinitely, with others it wears off after but a few hundred years. With some the effect does not occur at all. With others, tragically, the effect is not to stabilize the pattern, but to hasten its degeneration. The odds, however, are in the favour of the recipient, and there are few Goreans who, if they seem to need the serums, do not avail themselves of them. The player, as I have mentioned, was rather old. Not extremely old, but just rather old. His face was pale and lined, and his hair was white. He was smooth-shaven. The most startling thing to me about the man was not that he was older than one commonly sees on the streets of a Gorean city, but rather that he was clearly blind. The eyes were not pleasant to look upon, for they seemed empty of iris and pupil, and were simply ovoid glazes of masked scar tissue, ridged and irregular. Even the sockets of the eyes were ringed with white tissue. I knew then how the man had been blinded. A hot iron had been pressed into each of his eyes, probably long ago. In the centre of his forehead there was a large brand, the capital initial of the Gorean word for slave, in block script. But I knew he was not a slave, for it is not permitted that players be slave. That a slave should play is regarded as an insult to free men, and an insult to the game. Further, no free man would care to be beaten by a slave. I gathered from the blinding and the mark on his forehead that the man had once offended a slaver, a man of power in the city. "The pieces are set," said the vintner, his fingers trembling. "Your terms?" asked the player. "I move first," said the vintner. This, of course, was an advantage, permitting the vintner to choose his own opening, an opening he may have studied for a lifetime. Moreover, having the first move, he might more speedily develop his pieces, bringing them into the central areas of the board, where they might control crucial squares, the crossroads of the board. And further, having the first move, he would probably be able to carry the initiative of the aggressor several moves into the game, perhaps to the conclusion. Players, when playing among themselves with men of equal strength, frequently play for a draw when they do not have the first move. "Very well," said the player. "Further," said the vintner, "I declare for the 3-move option at my time of choice, and you must play without the Uber and Ubara or the first townsman." Now by this time there were 4 or 5 other individuals gathered about beside myself to observe the play. There was a builder and 2 saddle-makers, a baker and a tarn-keeper, a fellow who wore on his shoulder a green patch, indicating he favoured the greens. Indeed, since there were no races this day in R, and he wore the patch, he perhaps worked in the tarn-cots of the green. None of this crowd seemed to much object to my presence there, though to be sure none would stand near me. In the prospect of a game, Goreans tend to forget the distances, amenities, and trepidations of more sober moments, and through this small crowd, when it heard the terms of the vintner, there coursed a mutter of irritation. "Very well," said the player, looking out over the board placidly, seeing nothing. "And the odds I choose," said the vintner, "are 1 to 80. At this a real growl of anger coursed through the onlookers. 1 to 80, said the vintner firmly, triumphantly. "Very well," said the player. "Ubar's townsman to physician 7, said the vintner. "The Sentian opening," said one of the saddle-makers. The baker looked over his shoulder and called down the street to some men gathered there. "The Sentian!" The men ambled over to watch. I was supposed they were interested in seeing what the player's response would be to Yellow's 14th move, a move on which authorities disagreed sharply. Some favour Ubar's initiate to scribe 3, and others the withdrawal of Ubar's spearman to cover the vulnerable Ubar's 2. To my surprise, the player chose the withdrawal of Ubar's spearman to cover Ubar 2, which seemed to me rather defensive, and surely cost him the possibility of a dangerous but promising counter-attack, which would eventually, if all went well, culminate with his second townsman at his opponent's initiate 2. When this move was made, I saw 2 or 3 of the observers look at one another in disgust and wink, and then turn and walk away. The vintner, however, didn't seem to notice, but made the standard aggressive response, pressing his attack forward by moving second spearman to initiate 5. The face of the player seemed placid. I myself was keenly disappointed. It seemed reasonably clear to me at that point that the player had made a presumably weaker move in order to prejudice the game against himself, a move which could be defended, however, on the grounds that certain authorities favoured it. I myself in Corybar had seen Kentius of Kos playing his own opening more than a dozen times, and he had never drawn back the Ubara spearman at that point. When I saw the excitement of the vintner and the calm, stoic placidity of the player, I felt sad, for I recognized, as did several of the others, that this game, expensive though it might be, was to be the vintner's. The vintner, you must understand, was not a bad player. He was actually quite skilled, and would have played well among even gifted Goreans, to whom the game is almost second nature, but he was not of player calibre by far. I continued to watch, but not happily. At 1 or 2 points I noted the player had made subtly ineffective moves, apparently sound, but yet leaving weaknesses which could be, even 4 or 5 moves in the future, exploited rather decisively. Late in the game the player seemed to rally, and the vintner began to sweat and rub his fingers together, held his head in his hands, studying the board as though he would bore through it with his gaze. No one watching was much impressed, incidentally, that the player was blind, and yet remembering each move and the complexities of the board. Koreans often play without the board and pieces, though generally they prefer them, because then less effort need be expended on the purely mnemonic matters of keeping the pattern in mind, move to move. I myself had seen chess masters on Earth play 20 boards simultaneously and blindfolded. Yet I, of Earth origin, while recognizing that what I was witnessing was actually not as astonishing as it may seem, was nevertheless impressed. The vintner, of course, seemed to give no heed to anything but the game. At one point, when the vintner seemed hard-pressed, I and several others noted that his hand strayed to the board, moving his second spearman to builder 4 from physician 4, thus placing him on an open column. One of the saddle-makers cried out in anger, "Watch out there! He moved second spearman to builder 4. "I did not," cried the vintner, almost a shriek. The player looked puzzled. All eyes turned to the player, and he put his head down for a moment, apparently reconstructing the game from memory, through all of its better than 40 moves to that point, and then he smiled. "His second spearman," he said, "should be at builder 4. "You see?" cried the vintner gleefully. Angrily the saddle-maker turned away and strode down the street. No one said anything further. From time to time others would come and watch, but as it became clear what was occurring they would leave. At most times there were, however, some 7 or 8 individuals, including myself, who were watching. Finally it grew late in the end game, and it would be but a matter of 4 or 5 moves that the player's homestone must be lost. The vintner had taken his 3-move option late in the game to build up an incredibly devastating attack. The player was now in such a predicament that I doubted that Kentis of Kos or Quintus of Tor, or even the city's champion Scormus of Ar could have done much. I and the others in the crowd were angry. I spoke. The player, of course, could only hear my voice. "A tarn disc of gold and of double weight to red, should red win." The crowd gasped. The vintner acted as though struck. The player lifted his sightless eyes toward my face. I took from my belt a tarn disc of double weight and of gold, and gave it to the player, who took it in his fingers and felt its weight, and then he put it between his teeth and bit it. He handed it back to me. "It is truly of gold. Do not mock me." "A double tarn to red should red win," I said. Such an amount I knew would not be likely to be earned in a year by a player. The player turned his head toward me, lifting the scarred remains of his eyes as though he might see. Every nerve in that old face seemed strained, as though trying to understand what there might lie beyond him in the darkness that was his world, save for the memory of the movement of pieces on the checkered board. He put out his hand over the board, and I grasped it firmly. I held his hand for a moment, and he held mine. I felt his grip and smiled, for I knew then, blinded and branded, weak and old, he was yet a man. He released my hand and sat back, cross-legged, his back straight as that of an Uba, a smile playing across the corners of his mouth. The sightless eyes seemed to gleam. "The second townsman," he said, "to Uba's builder 9. A cry of astonishment coursed through the crowd. Even the vintner cried out. He must be insane, I said to myself. Such a move was utterly unrelated to the game. It was random, meaningless. He was subject to one of the most devastating attacks that could be mounted in the game. His home stone in 4 moves would fall. He must defend for his very life. With a trembling hand, the vintner shoved his second spearman to the left, capturing the player's first spearman, which had not been defended. I inwardly groaned. "Uba's rider of the High Thalarian," said the player, "to Uba's physician 8. I closed my eyes. It was another meaningless move. The crowd looked on, staggered, puzzled, speechless. Was this not a player? Relentlessly the vintner forced through again with his second spearman, this time capturing the player Obara's rider of the High Thalarian. "Obara's scribe to Obara's scribe 6, said the player. Now, under other conditions I would have left at that point, but as I held the gold piece in question, I knew that I would remain to the end, which, as some consolation, would be but short now. Even the vintner seemed disturbed. "Do you wish to reconsider your last move?" he said, offering a rare concession among players of the game, and one I had expected from the vintner from what I have seen him to offer. I decided he was perhaps not such a bad fellow. Perhaps winning meant more to him than it should. "O'Bara scribe to O'Bara scribe 6, repeated the player, and mechanically the vintner made the move on the board for the player. "My first townsman captures O'Bara scribe," said the vintner. The capture of the player's homestone would take place on the next move. "Do you wish to reconsider your move?" asked the player, looking across the board, not seeing but smiling. There seemed to be something grand about him in that moment, as though it were a gesture of magnanimity worthy of a victorious Ubar. The vintner looked at him puzzled. "No," he said, "I do not." The player shrugged. "I capture your home stone on the next move," said the vintner. "You have no next move," said the player. The crowd gasped, and they and I and the vintner studied the board. "Ah!" I cried, though the outburst was scarcely in keeping with the sombre black I wore, and an instant later the tarn-keeper and the saddle-maker cried out and began to stamp their feet in the dust and pound their fists against their left shoulders. Then others watching cried out in glee. I myself removed my sword from its sheath and with it struck my shield. And then the vintner began to howl with pleasure and slap his knees, so pleased was he with the wonder at it, though he himself was the victim. "Magnificent!" he cried, weeping, taking the player by the shoulders and shaking him. And then the vintner himself, as proud as though it had been his own, announced the player's next move. "Scribe takes home stone." The crowd and I cried out with delight, marvelling on it, the now apparent simplicity of it, the attack which had not been so much mounted as revealed by the apparently meaningless moves intended only to clear the board for that vital attack, coming from the improbable O'Bara scribe, one of the least powerful pieces on the board, yet, when used in combination with, say, a townsman and a rider of the high Falarian, as devastating as the O'Bar itself. None of us, including the vintner, had so much suspected the attack. The vintner pressed the copper tarn disc which the player had won from him into the player's hands, and the player placed this coin in his pouch. I then pressed into the hands of the player the tarn disc of gold, of double weight, and the man clenched it in his hands and smiled and rose to his feet. The vintner was picking up the pieces and putting them back in the leather game bag, which the player then slung about his shoulder. The vintner then handed him the board, which the player hung over his other shoulder. "Thank you for playing," said the vintner. The player put out his hand and touched the vintner's face, remembering it. "Thank you for playing," said the player. "I wish you well," said the vintner. "I wish you well," said the player. The vintner then turned and left. As he did so, I heard some of the bystanders, the saddle-maker and the fellow who was the town-keeper, he who wore the patch of the greens, discussing the game. "It was really quite simple," said the saddle-maker. "Even obvious." I smiled, and I noted that the player too smiled. "You are a merchant?" asked the player. "No," I said. "How is it, then, that you have such riches?" "It means nothing. Can I help you to your home?" "You are surely of high caste to have such gold." "May I take you to your home?" The town-keeper, breaking away from the saddle-maker, came over to us. He was a short man with close-cropped brown hair and a squarish face. I noted the patch of the greens on his shoulder. He smiled at me. "You did well," he said, "killer," and with a grin turned and left. I turned again to the player, but he was now standing there in the street, seeming somehow alone, though I stood at his side. "You are of the assassins?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "it is my caste." He pressed the piece of gold into my hand and turned away, stumbling from me, reaching out with his right hand to guide himself along the wall. "Wait," I said. "You've won this. Take it." I ran to him. "No," he said, striking out wildly with his hand, trying to force me away. I stepped back. He stood there, panting, not seeing me, his body bent over, angry. "It is black gold," he said. "It is black gold." He then turned away and began to grope his way from the place of the game. I stood there in the street and watched him go, in my hand holding the piece of gold which I had meant to be his. And